Welcome to the MIT Leadership Center video series. Today we have Stan McChrystal with us. Welcome, Stan.
Thanks.
Stan has been in the military for 34 plus years and is now working intensively in the civilian world trying to make a difference there as well. Look forward to visiting with you a little bit about leadership in your life. So let's begin.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. As you look back on the leadership work that you've done over the years and who you are as a leader, what are one of the two of the most powerful shaping experiences you've had that have impacted your work as a leader? Can you think of one or two that made a difference?
Sure. I think we all have inflection points in our evolution as a leader. I think lessons can come before and after, but you may not be ready to hear them. When I was a young captain, I commanded a mechanized infantry company, about 120 soldiers. And I had a battalion commander came in, a new battalion commander came in, and he was named Tom Graney, and he was a phenomenal leader, but he was very non-standard. He had a little bit of a paunch, he smoked heavily, he liked to drink now and again. And so he was sort of the opposite of some of the ramrod-like leadership traits that you talk, except he was frighteningly competent and he cared deeply. And so I learned that those external things that sometimes leaders, how they dress, how they act, may have some value, but they're not the core of what's important. And that leader once joked with the battalion. He said he didn't like to do physical training too much. He says, I want to know that every soldier's in physical training formation at 6:30 tomorrow morning, because when I roll over and go back to sleep, I want to know where you are. Now, it was a joke, but it was his way of connecting with us, but also reminding us that certain things are important. And he was this phenomenal leader without having to paint himself in the stereotypical cloak of leadership. He was so good at making the unit better that he didn't have to take on outside trappings.
You know, that's interesting to me, because in the corporate world, and I think it may be the same in your world from your military experience, the systems rarely truly reinforce the development of that kind of leader, the development that you're paying attention to building leadership capacity. It can often become all about me and my progression in my career and that sort of a thing. It sounds like he was one of those guys.
He was one of those people that was more focused on developing you than himself, more focused on making the organization work than he was in projecting a personal image. And I think you're right, because if you think about many organizations, your height, your charisma, your ability to articulate things becomes maybe more important than the actual performance of the organization that you're there to lead. And so if we did sort of a blind test and looked at the performance of units but couldn't see the leaders, couldn't be affected by their ability to talk or act smoothly a certain way, I think sometimes we'd find that people who don't fit the mold that we expect may produce better outcomes. It would be an interesting set of studies.
How do you see through that?
I talked to an investor, a private equity investor once. I said, how do you select firms that you think might be good to invest in? And he said, well, I don't go meet with a CEO. And I said, why? He says, because most CEOs have developed the skills to project well and to paint a good picture. He says, I go look at certain factors, certain economic factors, and then I try to go into the company and see how people interact. I think it's very true. You can go to an organization in any kind, and you can be sort of mesmerized by their ability to project a story. But if you peel beneath the layers and you ask individuals below how they feel, if you look at just whatever metrics are appropriate for that organization, how they produce, I think often you get a much more real sense of it. But it's hard to break through. If you go to visit a company or an organization, typically they want to control your time and give you a very staged briefing and whatnot, because they have a story they want to tell. And there's nothing evil about that, but it's typically not the whole story.
So as a general, everything's getting polished and cleaned and shaped and presented, and you wander in a space when you're in the military and they're ready for you. How do you avoid getting tricked by the surface?
It's a real challenge because with no evil intent, they will schedule your visit to the moment so that you will walk here, get this briefing, walk there. And if you break that schedule, there are some negatives. People will have prepared and then you will change it, and therefore you'll cause a lot of people who have done a lot of work for nothing. So you can be very thoughtless if you do that. What I found is you need to project up front your expectations for the visit. You need to tell the people beforehand, this is what I don't want and this is what I would like. And you have to set up venues that allow you to talk to groups of people at lower levels. And you can't just barge in and throw out what they've done. You've got to create that environment to do it. And then you've got to use surrogates as well. When you go visit, you've got to understand that you're a single person with the limits of your senses. You've got to have people in whom you trust that can also visit either at other times or while you are and ask different questions and talk to people on the periphery. It's not trying to deceive anyone, it's trying to fully understand. A complex organization deserves more than a two-dimensional snapshot to try to form a judgment from.
That two-dimensional snapshot doesn't portray the full edge of what's going on.
Right.
And part of the deepest leadership work, it seems like, is probing with intentionality what we don't know. It's that unknown space that in a military world can really create disasters, but in a private personal world it can do the same thing. Are there things, beyond what you just described, which is partly, getting informants in one sense, people in different parts of the system, going out of your way to break up too rigid of a schedule when you're seeing things? Anything else you do that prepares you to uncover those unknowns?
I think it first starts with a mindset. If I was to show you a photograph of something, even that looked fairly straightforward, that the average person would draw a conclusion, this is what I've seen. If I were to turn the television on and we saw a large number of people gathered in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and then someone said there's a large demonstration against the government, we would see that and we would draw conclusions. But the reality is there's a large demonstration. We have no idea what it is. Somebody says it's for or against the government. And so the reality is the danger is we can see these fairly limited depictions, but because we tend to believe photography particularly, we tend to assume that that's correct. And so how do you get beyond that? First, if you got to get more inputs than just that picture, and you've got to learn to ask wider questions. There's also a danger that you can fall prey to. The information you get is information people wanted to send you. If you get tweets or you get blogs or you get any kinds of combination, those are pieces of information that people have sent you because they want you to have them. And that's different from reaching for information that people have not asked for. Now, if they're your trusted people who are out there asking questions that you've armed them with, that's fine. But if they're not, then you've got to first ask, why is Vladimir Putin projecting this image and telling us that in Ukraine this is what's happening? Because he has obviously a desire that we form a certain opinion. And that's true of so many things. It goes from celebrity, public relations and whatnot. So it's first developing the ability to understand what you don't know. The second is developing those questions that you would need to know. In the military, we call them priority information requirements, or PIR. And you say, these are the items of information I need to know. And then from that, you develop a collection plan. How am I going to know that? What indicators or what pieces of information, and where do I have to have them in and what time to fill that? And the leader's got to give a thought, because if the leader is passive, then the leader knows what people have decided to shove their way. And because of this flood of information now, it's very easy to feel passive. You know, you put your phone so that you get certain news alerts, etc., and you are in the receive mode, and you haven't crafted the questions or the hooks to pull what you really need.
Interesting. It reminds me of an experience I had with an MBA student years ago when I taught at Dartmouth. But the student had worked in a consumer products company, and he was in a position where there was rapid turnover in the position. And they had decided to, instead of giving people a handbook of what to do, the essential information, they actually gave them a list of like 20 questions. You need to get the answer to these questions if you're going to do this job well. And so I'm thinking of some of your more senior positions in the military. If you were to give someone else going into that role, these are some questions that really matter if you're sitting in this seat. What might a few of those be?
Yeah, I think that's a great technique, and better than I saw in much of my career. If someone had told me what you need to know to be effective here, and they could have even given you a little bit of a hint where to go get that. But I think the first thing is, when I go into an organization, you have to know, how does the organization work? How does information flow? How are decisions made? Where does that happen? You know, some of that's put out in manuals, and often it's also tribal. It's how does it really occur?
Yeah.
Then I'd want to know about people. I'd want to know, okay, who does what here? Because again, the positions in organizational charts rarely match up to what people actually do. Their influence is often quite different. So if you ask someone the question, say, develop an understanding of how the organization works, developing an understanding of what people matter and who influences who, and be able to draw that out. And then I think the factor of what decisions matter. What are the important decisions that this organization makes or should make on a routine basis? And sometimes it's very different than you think. There are sometimes some very basic decisions that are of extraordinary importance, and they may be being made and people just don't talk about them or haven't focused on them. And I think probing an organization or a person to make them learn that would be very valuable.
And now in your work, obviously you're doing you're trying to make a difference in companies and moving them to a more successful place. And part of your work in doing that is you're coming in, you're asking questions. Is there a way in which you ask these sorts of questions that opens up a system to be more responsive and willing to listen to the question and to actually do something with it versus shut it down, close it off, and kick Stan out kind of thing?
It's a great question. When we go into an organization, we typically have two phases to that. We call it a discovery phase. And the first is a survey that we send out. And the survey is the same for everyone, and it's typically sent out by computer. And it's got a number of questions, not long, but it elicits from them a sense of how the organization operates, what people make decisions, what people might not be accessible enough for people to use. So you start to see how the organization works, and then where the friction points might be, and where the real enablers are. That gives people a sense of, okay, we're trying to figure out what really matters here. Most people won't be threatened by that because they can sense from the questions, this is valuable stuff to know. We then follow that up with targeted interviews with certain people, people who have, based upon either their position in the organization or by the results of the survey, if they say that Hal is very important, a bunch of people in the survey say, I go to Hal when I've got problems, and we want to talk to Hal. Why do they come to you? How do you solve the problems, and get an idea? And that gives them, people, a sense. Now, with a survey and with interviews, you create expectations. If I go into an organization and say, I want to know what we can do to help you, and a new leader does that and then does nothing to act on any of the conclusions, the next survey will have much less effect because people will say, why should I bother?
That's right.
And so I think it's very important that as we do this, and as a leader asks us to do this, they line themselves up. If I find problems, I'm going to try to address them. If I find things that I can help in terms of resourcing, I'm going to do something about it. And regardless, I am going to give feedback to the entire organization so that they get a sense of what the outcome was and what we're doing about it.
Speaking of feedback, what's been a piece or two of the most difficult feedback you've received as a leader? The kind that sort of takes your breath away a little bit and sets you back.
Yeah. I remember I was younger at the time, but someone told me I was arrogant. And of course, that's a pretty harsh term.
That's right.
And so the response is, okay, why do you think I'm arrogant? And whether it's valid or not, part of the feedback that they gave me was, well, sometimes you're in your room, you don't talk to people, particularly peers and whatnot. And the reality is I'm very introverted. And when I go into a social, like a cocktail party kind of thing, I'm very uncomfortable.
Right.
And so my defense mechanism is not to walk around and be a backslapper and handshaker. I'm just not as comfortable doing that. And that can be perceived differently than I think the reality. I've learned, and we all have coping mechanisms, as you get older, those basic traits don't change. You don't become less introverted. What you do is you become more able to develop coping skills to overcome it. So I learned particularly with junior people, I would go down and I would work it because I owed them that effort. Whether it's uncomfortable for me or not, I owe them that, because young people won't come up and approach the older person. So the older person has that responsibility. And it was funny, in my mind, as I viewed it as my responsibility, I found it easier to do because I felt it was something I should do.
Interesting. Do you think that being an introvert, the way you're describing, actually helps you ask better questions? I mean, you've caused me to wonder that, because sometimes introverts, they step back enough to see things other people don't see.
I think that's possible. I don't claim that I ask wonderful questions, but I do claim that I do like to ask questions. And one reason is I think introversion, that's a way to get a conversation going. It's hard for me to go, hey, how about them socks? But to ask questions and have somebody give me a window into themselves starts to develop. And an introvert normally does much better in a one-on-one conversation than they will in a group. And so I found that starting to ask questions will establish a rapport that makes it easier to do the conversation. And of course, once you start asking questions and become informed, then it takes you down all kinds of roads, not just relationship building, but also you're really getting insights that you wouldn't get in a very superficial conversation.
I mean, you've been a senior leader, you've worked with a lot of senior leaders. Are there forces operating in their world that makes it difficult for them to do what you just said?
Yeah, there are a number of forces, and the first is time. It's very hard to be on this incredible schedule and sit down and pretend to have a relationship building conversation when it's just a few minutes, or it will never happen again. Some good senior leaders get very good at doing as well as they can in that situation. The second thing is the sensitivity of what you're talking about. In the age of political leaks and social media and whatnot, even conversations in very small groups, if they are genuine, can suddenly be leaked or be shared. And that can undermine. Future conversations are never the same after that has occurred. And so as a consequence, leaders become more guarded. I think there's also just the problem with differences in culture. It's not just differences between Americans and a foreign culture, it's also within our own culture, military and civilian, between intelligence agencies and Department of State. You grow up in these different worlds that become more insular and more tribal as you rise, and you just don't have the comfortable trust that takes time to build. And that can't just be built organizationally. A lot of that's got to be built individually. People, individual to individual. And so, particularly when we're moving fast and doing 1,000 things, it's hard to do. And not all of it can be done digitally. You can buttress a relationship with telephone calls and emails and whatnot. But I don't think you really can build the foundation of one that way. I think there's a certain amount of face-to-face interaction that must form the foundation. And then, I mean, my wife and I can text or have very short phone calls that are very substantive because we've been together for so long.
Right.
But if we didn't know each other, it wouldn't have that sinew that keeps it strong.
Could you do the work you do as a leader without your eyes?
It's a great question.
I've never asked this question before. I mean, you're talking about a real deep connection with somebody, and I've noticed that, you know, your eyes don't wander in conversations.
No. Yeah.
You're paying careful attention.
That's a great question, and I think in my case, no. Possibly, you know, I'm told that if you lose your sight, your other senses come. But for me, it's funny. I prioritize, or I hierarchically rank interaction, starting with face-to-face. But I hate to talk on the telephone. In fact, if you call my cell phone, my voicemail message says, I don't do voicemail. Because I don't like to talk on the phone, because I like to see someone's face. I like video teleconferences, and we do them in my company all the time, and we did them forward. Because even though you're still digitally communicating, I want to see what the person's reactions are. And I think part of that's introversion, because I think I'm less secure than just talk. I really want to see, because if you look disinterested, I will end the conversation.
It's not worth the energy.
That's right. And so I think it's a great question. I think my answer is no.
Do you think that came from when you were younger? And it comes back a bit to the notion that sometimes we do have these role models in our lives as we're growing up. You know, people who were good at paying attention in a conversation. People who excelled at that. In fact, they used eye contact not in a manipulative way, but it was just genuine, authentic. Are there those sorts of folks in your world growing up who were that way?
Yeah, I think so, but I got a couple negative lessons too. I had worked with a guy who I loved, but you'd go into his office and he always had CNN on TV in the corner on this television mounted on the wall. And so you'd be trying to talk to him about something, and he'd be watching that, and he'd nod, and he'd even respond. But I found it very, very frustrating. Then when I took over as a battalion commander, one of my young officers, my first week in the job, came and said, you know, when the previous commander was here, he had a desk, and then there were 2 chairs and a little coffee table out in front of it. He said whenever we came and talked to him, we'd sit in a chair, and he'd stay behind his desk, and he'd be looking at his computer, he'd be messing with papers. And he described that to me. He didn't say any more. And I got out around my desk, and when everybody came to see me, I'd go sit in one of those 2 chairs, not behind my desk. And so he'd unconsciously give me this incredible advice that I still believe in. If you stay behind your desk, you keep this barrier, and you're tempted to be distracted. So what I try to do is go out around and not put anything in front of myself, because if I have a distraction, I'll look at it. If I keep my computer open, I'll glance over. And so unless it's a conversation that's so easy I can be doing that, I try to take everything away, focus on the person. I also find that if you do that, the person takes the conversation more seriously. You know, if they want part of my time, or if I want part of their time, and I'm staring at them, typically they will feel like, wow, maybe we shouldn't waste this time.
Which then, the notion of maverick leadership means that we're literally trying to push the status quo in a system. And my guess is that when you've tried to do this in different parts of your career, what we're talking about has probably made a big impact. You can't push military systems with long histories and all kinds of accomplishments without that sort of connection, I suspect.
If you're trying to change a system, they've got to believe that you want to change it and that you can change it.
Yeah.
They won't believe, wanting to change it's not enough. They'll go, that's great.
Yeah.
They've got to sense, hey, I think this person's pushing on this. I think it might move.
Yeah.
And you, of course, want to enlist them to help push with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the key thing. If they don't think you're bought in.
Yeah. So final question. It's you shared with me you're now a grandfather.
I am.
And congratulations on that. And if you think of your grandchild and kids out there in the world who are going to be the next generation of leaders, and you could give them a single gift as they prepare for that future, what might it be?
I think clearly the ability to empathize with people. And I carefully don't say sympathize, because it's easy to have sympathy for all the things. But the ability to deal with someone and, to the greatest extent possible, see things from their perspective. You don't have to agree, but you have to have the ability to turn that lens around so that whether you're dealing with someone from another sex or another age or another culture or another religion, you can see it. Because if you operate under the theory that most people are rational, they're doing things for a rational reason. And so when you see behavior that you disagree with or you think is irrational, if you really probe it, you'll typically find causes that really are the seat of what you're trying to deal with. And if we just look at it and we go, that's irrational, that's bad, and we don't have at least the respect for other people that causes us to be empathetic and understand, then we're often solving the wrong problem.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I wish you the best in the work you're doing and the difference you're making.